3 years ago, I was escorted out of Technova Solutions by security guards while my colleagues watched in stunned silence. My crime? Writing what my manager called inelegant code. Today, that same company just filed for bankruptcy, and sitting in my mailbox is a $2.5 million payment, money they never wanted to pay, for work they said was worthless. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Marcus Richardson, and until 18 months ago I was a senior software engineer at Technova Solutions, a mid-sized tech company in Austin, Texas, specializing in enterprise software solutions. The company had built its reputation on delivering cutting-edge applications for Fortune 500 clients, and I genuinely believed I was part of something meaningful. I'd been with Technova for 4 years, working my way up from a junior developer position. My track record spoke for itself. Every project I touched was delivered on time, often ahead of schedule, and always functioned exactly as specified. My code worked. It solved problems. It made clients happy. But apparently, that wasn't enough for Bradley Morrison, the new engineering director who joined the company 6 months before my termination. Morrison had arrived with impressive credentials: MIT graduate, former Google engineer, the kind of resume that made executives swoon during word meetings. He came in promising to modernize our development practices and elevate code quality to industry standards. What he actually brought was an obsession with code aesthetics that bordered on the pathological. The first red flag appeared during a routine code review in March. I had just finished developing a critical module for our biggest client, Meridian Financial. The module handled complex transaction processing, integrating with multiple legacy systems that dated back to the early 2000s. Getting these systems to communicate properly was like conducting an orchestra where half the instruments were out of tune, and the other half were playing different songs entirely. The solution required what I called creative pragmatism. Some functions were longer than the arbitrary limits Morrison preferred. Variable names prioritized clarity over brevity. Comments explained not just what the code did, but why certain approaches were necessary given the constraints we faced. Most importantly, the code worked flawlessly, processing thousands of transactions daily without a single error. Morrison's feedback was scathing. He called my approach amateur-hour programming, and demanded a complete rewrite. According to him, my functions were too long, my variable names weren't descriptive enough in some places, and too verbose in others, and my comment style didn't match his interpretation of best practices. He scheduled mandatory one-on-one sessions where he would dissect my code line by line, pointing out every deviation from his personal style guide. These sessions became weekly torture chambers. Morrison would project my code on his office wall and pick apart every decision I'd made. He'd question why I used a while loop instead of a for loop, why I declared a variable at the top of a function instead of closer to where it was used, why I chose one naming convention over another. Never once did he acknowledge that the code functioned perfectly or that clients were satisfied with the results. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Morrison obsessed over code formatting, actual bugs were slipping through in other parts of the system. Sarah Chen, one of our most talented developers, had flagged a critical security vulnerability in the user authentication system. Instead of addressing it immediately, Morrison insisted she first refactor her detection algorithm to meet his style guideline. The vulnerability remained unpatched for 3 weeks, while Sarah rewrote perfectly functional code to satisfy Morrison's aesthetic preferences. Meanwhile, client complaints began trickling in, not about functionality but about delayed delivery. Projects that previously took weeks were now stretching into months, as developers spent more time reformatting code than solving actual problems. Morrison's response was to implement even stricter code review processes, requiring 3 levels of approval for any commit to the main branch. The breaking point came in July during our work on Project Lighthouse, a comprehensive data analytics platform for Meridian Financial. The project had a hard deadline. Meridian needed the system operational before their quarterly board meeting. Missing this deadline would trigger penalty clauses in our contract and potentially cost us the client entirely. I had developed the core analytics engine over the course of 6 weeks, working nights and weekends to meet the aggressive timeline. The engine was a marvel of efficiency, capable of processing terabytes of financial data and generating complex reports in real time. I'd integrated machine learning algorithms for fraud detection, implemented advanced caching mechanisms for optimal performance, and built-in redundancy systems to ensure zero downtime. The code wasn't pretty by Morrison's standard. Function names like process transaction batch with fraud detection exceeded his character limits. Some algorithms were implemented in ways that prioritized performance over readability. Comments were extensive, explaining not just the logic but the business reasoning behind each decision. It was the kind of code that gets results, functional, reliable, and thoroughly tested. Morrison's initial review came back with 47 critical issues that needed to be addressed before the code could be deployed. None of these issues affected functionality. They were purely cosmetic concerns, indentation inconsistencies, variable names that didn't follow his preferred conventions, functions that could theoretically be broken into smaller pieces, even though doing so would hurt performance. I explained that implementing his changes would require at least 2 weeks of additional work, pushing us past the critical deadline. Morrison's response was unequivocal: "We will not deploy inelegant code, regardless of timeline pressures. If this means missing the deadline, so be it. Our reputation for quality is more important than any single client." That statement revealed everything about Morrison's fundamental misunderstanding of our business. We weren't an academic institution publishing research papers on optimal coding practices. We were a commercial software company with real clients who had real deadlines and real business needs. Our reputation wasn't built on code that looked pretty in reviews. It was built on delivering solutions that work. I made a decision that would ultimately cost me my job but save our client relationship. Working over a 3-day weekend, I created what I called the Morrison-compliant version of the analytics engine. Every function was broken down into bite-sized pieces that met his arbitrary length requirements. Variable names were shortened to match his/her conventions, even when the shorter names were less descriptive. Comments were reduced to minimal annotations that said little about the actual business logic. The result was code that looked exactly how Morrison wanted but performed significantly worse than my original implementation. Processing times increased by 30%. The simplified error handling made the system more vulnerable to edge cases. The modular structure he demanded created unnecessary complexity that made future maintenance more difficult, not easier, but it passed his review with flying colors. Morrison praised the clean architecture and professional naming conventions. He held it up as an example of what all developers should strive for during our next team meeting. The fact that it was objectively inferior to my original implementation seemed irrelevant to him. Project Lighthouse deployed on schedule with Morrison's preferred version of the code. Within the first week, Meridian's IT team reported performance issues during peak processing periods. The 30% slowdown I'd predicted was actually closer to 40% under real-world conditions. Error logs showed problems that my original implementation would have caught and handled gracefully. Fixing these issues required deploying patches that essentially reverted many of Morrison's demanded changes. We had to restore the longer, more descriptive function names, because Meridian's internal documentation referenced them. Performance-critical sections had to be restructured back to approaches that prioritized speed over Morrison's aesthetic preference. The elegant code became a maintenance nightmare that required constant attention. Morrison blamed these problems on my poor initial implementation, rather than acknowledging that his changes had introduced the issue. During team meetings, he would reference Project Lighthouse as an example of why stricter code standards were necessary, conveniently ignoring the fact that his standards had created the problems we were now scrambling to fix. The situation deteriorated further when Rebecca Torres, our lead quality assurance engineer, presented metrics showing that development velocity had decreased by 60% since Morrison's arrival. Bug reports were actually increasing not because of functionality issues, but because developers were making mistakes while rushing to reformat code to meet arbitrary deadlines. Morrison's response was to implement even more stringent review process. He introduced automated tools that would reject any commit that didn't match his style guide, regardless of functionality. He scheduled mandatory code elegance training sessions where developers had to present their work for group critique. The entire engineering culture shifted from problem solving to performance art, where looking good mattered more than working well. Other senior developers began expressing concerns privately. David Kumar, who had been with the company for 7 years, confided that he was considering leaving because he spent more time reformatting working code than building new features. Lisa Patterson, our mobile development specialist, mentioned that client feedback had become increasingly negative as delivery times stretched longer and longer. The final straw came in October when Morrison announced that all existing code would need to be audited and brought up to his standards before any new features could be developed. This meant weeks or potentially months of work refactoring perfectly functional systems to meet cosmetic requirements while actual business needs went unaddressed. During a particularly contentious team meeting, I made the mistake of voicing what everyone was thinking. I pointed out that our clients didn't care about variable naming conventions, they cared about systems that worked reliably and delivered business value. I suggested that maybe we should focus on fixing actual bugs and delivering promised features instead of rewriting working code to satisfy arbitrary style preferences. Morrison's face went through several shades of red before he responded in a voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, your attitude perfectly exemplifies the kind of amateur thinking that's holding this team back. Until you can demonstrate a commitment to professional-grade development practices, I question whether you belong in a senior role." The room fell silent. Every developer present knew that my code worked better than most, that my projects delivered on time, that clients specifically requested me for complex integrations. But in Morrison's world, none of that mattered if the code didn't look the way he wanted it to look. 2 weeks later, I was called into a meeting with Morrison and Jennifer Walsh, the head of human resources. They had prepared a formal improvement plan that essentially required me to rewrite my approach to software development from the ground up. The plan included mandatory training sessions, weekly check-ins with Morrison, and a probationary period during which any deviation from his standards would result in immediate termination. I signed the document because I needed the job, but I also began updating my resume that same evening. The writing was on the wall, and it was written in Morrison's preferred font and formatted according to his style guide. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. The improvement plan became my daily reality for the next month. Every morning, I'd arrive at the office, knowing that Morrison would scrutinize my work with the intensity of a forensic investigator. He'd installed code analysis tools that flagged everything from indentation inconsistencies to function names that exceeded his preferred character limits. My commits, once straightforward and productive, became exercises in navigating an increasingly complex maze of arbitrary rules. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was being micromanaged into compliance, the rest of the engineering team was quietly falling apart. Janet Rodriguez, from the QA department, had compiled a troubling report showing that system crashes had increased by 200% since Morrison's style enforcement began. Developers were making basic errors, not because they lacked skill, but because they were exhausted from constantly reformatting working code to satisfy cosmetic requirements. During one particularly brutal week in November, 3 separate client systems experienced critical failures. The first was a payment processing module for Pinnacle Retail, a chain of luxury department stores. The original code had handled edge cases gracefully, but Morrison's demanded restructuring had simplified the error handling to meet his clean code philosophy. When Pinnacle's Black Friday sales created unexpected transaction patterns, the simplified system couldn't adapt, resulting in thousands of failed payments and angry customers. The second failure hit Global Tech Manufacturing's inventory management system. Morrison had insisted that all database queries be broken into smaller, more readable functions. The result was a system that made dozens of separate database calls where the original implementation had used efficient batch operations. Under normal load, the performance difference was negligible. During Global Tech's year-end inventory reconciliation, the inefficient queries created a cascade failure that brought down their entire supply chain tracking system for 6 hours. The third incident was the most damaging. Meridian Financial's fraud detection algorithms, which I had originally designed to process suspicious transactions in real time, had been optimized according to Morrison's standard. The complex mathematical models were split into numerous smaller functions, each with descriptive names that met his documentation requirement. Unfortunately, the constant function calls and data passing between modules introduced microsecond delays that accumulated into significant performance degradation. During a particularly busy trading day, Meridian's system failed to flag several fraudulent transactions in time, resulting in losses exceeding $400,000. Their legal team immediately began investigating whether the software failure constituted a breach of contract. The original fraud detection system would have caught those transactions without hesitation. Morrison's response to these failures was predictable and infuriating. Rather than acknowledging that his changes had introduced the problems, he doubled down on enforcement. He implemented even stricter code review processes and announced that all developers would undergo mandatory training on enterprise-grade development methodologies. The message was clear: the failures were proof that we needed more control, not less. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere became toxic. Experienced developers who had built their careers on solving complex problems were now spending 80% of their time reformatting working code. Innovation ground to a halt as every creative solution was subjected to style guide compliance checks that often rejected effective approaches in favor of elegant alternatives that didn't actually work better. Christopher Williams, our database architect, quit without notice after Morrison rejected his optimization of the user authentication system. Christopher's implementation had reduced login times by 70% and eliminated a security vulnerability that had been flagged by external auditors. Morrison's rejection was based entirely on variable naming conventions that didn't match his preferred style guide. Christopher's resignation letter, which was accidentally left on the printer, included the phrase, "I didn't become an engineer to play formatting games while real problems go unsolved." The departure of senior talent accelerated after Christopher left. Emma Thompson, who had designed our entire API infrastructure, accepted a position with a competitor after Morrison demanded she rewrite 3 years' worth of working code to match his architectural preferences. Kevin Park, our cybersecurity specialist, transferred to another division within the company rather than continue working under Morrison's management. Each departure created additional pressure on remaining developers. Projects that had previously been distributed among experienced teams were now handled by smaller groups of increasingly frustrated engineers. Quality suffered not because of technical incompetence, but because talented people were either leaving or spending their time on non-productive activity. My own situation deteriorated steadily throughout this period. Morrison had assigned himself as the primary reviewer for all my work, meaning that every line of code I wrote required his personal approval. His feedback became increasingly nitpicky and arbitrary. He'd reject implementations based on subjective preferences rather than objective technical criteria. One particularly memorable incident involved a data visualization module for Sterling Analytics, a financial consulting firm. The client had requested specific chart types and formatting options that required custom implementations. My solution integrated multiple JavaScript libraries and created exactly what the client wanted: interactive dashboards that their analysts could use to explore complex datasets in real time. Morrison's review focused entirely on my choice of variable names within the JavaScript functions. He objected to abbreviations like CX for context and element for element, insisting that all variables be spelled out completely regardless of industry convention. He demanded that I rewrite the entire module using his preferred naming scheme, even though doing so would require modifying hundreds of lines of working code. The rewrite took 3 days and introduced several subtle bugs because the longer variable names created confusion and nested functions. Sterling Analytics testing team immediately reported issues with chart rendering that hadn't existed in my original implementation. Fixing these problems required partially reverting to my original approach, but Morrison insisted that any reverted code be documented with detailed explanations of why his preferred standards couldn't be maintained. By December, the stress was affecting my health and personal relationships. My wife, Amanda, noticed that I was bringing work frustrations home every evening. I'd spend hours at our kitchen table not working on actual code, but rewriting functional implementations to satisfy arbitrary style requirements. The creative satisfaction that had originally drawn me to software development was completely gone, replaced by an endless cycle of cosmetic revisions. The breaking point came during the week before Christmas. Technova had landed a major contract with Apex Corporation, a logistics company that needed a complete overhaul of their shipping management system. The project was worth $3 million and represented the largest deal in company history. Success would position Technova for significant growth in the coming year. Apex's requirements were complex but clear. They needed a system that could handle real-time tracking of thousands of shipments, integrate with multiple carrier APIs, and provide predictive analytics for delivery optimization. The timeline was aggressive, full deployment by the end of January to coincide with their fiscal year planning. I volunteered to lead the technical implementation because the project aligned perfectly with my experience in API integration and real-time data processing. Morrison initially approved my involvement but insisted that all code would be subject to his enhanced review process, including his newly implemented architectural compliance verification, that added an additional week to the approval timeline for any major module. Working over the holiday break, I developed a robust system architecture that addressed all of Apex's requirements. The tracking module efficiently aggregated data from multiple sources, the API integration layer handled the complexities of different carrier systems, and the analytics engine provided the predictive capabilities Apex needed for route optimization. The code was dense and functional, prioritizing performance and reliability over Morrison's aesthetic preference. Function names were descriptive but practical, commenting focused on business logic rather than stylistic flourishes, and the overall structure emphasized maintainability and scalability. Every component had been thoroughly tested and validated against Apex's specifications. Morrison's review was devastating. He identified 63 critical violations of his coding standards, ranging from function length to comment format. He demanded a complete architectural redesign that would transform my efficient, monolithic processing modules into dozens of smaller, interconnected services that met his microservices philosophy. I explained that implementing his changes would require at least 3 weeks of additional development time, pushing the delivery date well past Apex's deadline. Furthermore, the proposed microservices architecture would introduce unnecessary complexity and potential points of failure for a system that needed to process time-sensitive logistics data. Morrison's response was uncompromising. "Marcus, your persistent inability to embrace professional development standards has become a serious concern. This project represents an opportunity to demonstrate that Technova can deliver enterprise-grade solutions, not amateur-hour implementations that happen to work." The phrase amateur-hour implementations that happen to work crystallized everything that was wrong with Morrison's approach. In his mind, functionality was secondary to appearance. A system that solved the client's problems efficiently was inferior to one that looked good in code reviews, regardless of actual performance or maintainability. I made a decision that would ultimately cost me my career at Technova, but save the company's largest contract. Over the following weekend, I created 2 versions of the Apex system. The first was a Morrison-compliant implementation that satisfied every item in his style guide. It featured meticulously formatted microservices, perfectly named functions, and documentation that read like technical poetry. It also performed terribly. The distributed architecture created network overhead that slowed processing by 40%. The elegant error handling couldn't cope with the real-world inconsistencies of carrier API response. The beautiful, modular design made troubleshooting nearly impossible because simple operations were spread across multiple services. The second version was my original implementation, refined and optimized based on additional tests. It handled Apex's requirements flawlessly, processed data efficiently, and included robust error handling for the unpredictable nature of logistics operations. The code wasn't pretty by Morrison's standards, but it solved the actual business problem. I submitted the Morrison-compliant version for official review, while quietly preparing the functional version for emergency deployment, if needed. Morrison praised the compliant version as finally demonstrating professional-grade architecture, and approved it for client presentation. The demonstration for Apex's technical team was scheduled for the first week of January. Morrison insisted on presenting the system personally, highlighting the clean architecture and scalable design principles that his management had enabled. He spent more time discussing code organization than actual functionality. Apex's CTO, Robert Chen, seemed impressed by Morrison's presentation until the live demonstration began. The system struggled to handle even the basic test data that Apex provided. Real-time tracking updates lagged by several minutes. API integrations failed under normal load conditions, and the predictive analytics module crashed when processing historical shipping data. Robert's feedback was diplomatically brutal. The architectural concepts are interesting, but we need a system that can handle our operational reality. These performance issues would be catastrophic in our production environment. Morrison assured Apex that the performance problems were minor configuration issues that could be resolved quickly. Privately, he blamed me for implementing his specifications incorrectly and demanded that I fix the problems immediately, while maintaining all of his architectural requirements. I spent the next week attempting to optimize Morrison's design without success. The fundamental problems weren't bugs, they were architectural limitations that couldn't be resolved without abandoning the microservices approach he had mandated. Every optimization I implemented improved one aspect while degrading another. Meanwhile, Apex grew increasingly impatient. Their CTO called daily for updates, and their legal team began reviewing the contract's performance clause. Technova's leadership started asking hard questions about project status and delivery timelines. The crisis deepened when Apex threatened to terminate the contract and pursue alternative solutions. $3 million and Technova's reputation were on the line because Morrison's beautiful code couldn't handle the ugly realities of logistics operations. That's when I made the decision that would ultimately lead to my termination. Without authorization from Morrison or company leadership, I deployed my original implementation to a testing environment and invited Apex's technical team to evaluate it independently. The difference was immediately apparent. The functional system handled Apex's test data effortlessly, processing real-time updates with millisecond precision, integrating smoothly with all carrier APIs, and providing accurate predictive analytics based on historical shipping patterns. Robert Chen's team completed their evaluation in 2 hours and immediately recommended proceeding with implementation. Morrison discovered my unauthorized deployment during a routine server audit the next morning. His reaction was swift and vindictive. Within an hour, I was called into an emergency meeting with Morrison, Jennifer Walsh from HR, and Thomas Bradley, Technova's chief operating officer. Morrison presented my actions as a deliberate act of insubordination that undermined company authority and violated established development protocols. He argued that deploying unauthorized code created security risks and demonstrated a complete disregard for professional standards. I tried to explain that my motivation was saving the company's largest contract, but Morrison framed my functional implementation as proof of my inability to work within established guidelines. According to him, the fact that my code worked better than his approved version was irrelevant. What mattered was following proper procedures and maintaining architectural consistency. Thomas Bradley's questions focused on the practical implications. He wanted to know why the official implementation had failed, why my alternative had succeeded, and what this meant for the Apex contract. His concerns were entirely business-focused, but Morrison steered the conversation back to policy violations and procedure compliance. The meeting ended with my immediate suspension pending a full investigation. Security escorted me from the building while my colleagues watched in stunned silence. My access to company systems was revoked, my keycard was deactivated, and I was instructed to await further communication from HR regarding the investigation's outcome. 3 days later, Jennifer Walsh called to inform me that my employment with Technova had been terminated effective immediately. The official reason was failure to comply with established development standards and unauthorized deployment of non-approved code. There was no mention of the fact that my unauthorized code had saved the Apex contract. Morrison had won. His vision of elegant, beautiful code had triumphed over my amateur hour implementations that merely solved problems and satisfied clients. Technova would continue developing software that looked professional in code reviews, regardless of whether it actually worked in the real world. But as I cleaned out my personal belongings from the box that security had packed for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't really the end of the story. Morrison's approach was fundamentally unsustainable, and eventually reality would intrude on his carefully constructed world of elegant code and beautiful architectures. I had no idea how right I was about that, or how spectacular the eventual reckoning would be. Getting fired from Technova felt like being expelled from a toxic relationship, painful, but ultimately liberating. For the first time in months, I could wake up without dreading Morrison's daily code reviews or worrying about whether my variable names met his arbitrary standard. The stress headaches that had become my constant companion began to fade within days. Amanda was surprisingly supportive when I explained what had happened. She'd watched me transform from someone who loved solving complex problems into someone who spent evenings rewriting working code to satisfy stylistic preferences. "Maybe this is exactly what you needed," she said over coffee the morning after my termination. "You haven't talked about enjoying your work in over a year." She was right. The creative satisfaction that had originally drawn me to software development had been systematically stripped away by Morrison's obsession with appearances over functionality. Now, for the first time since his arrival, I could think about code as a tool for solving problems rather than an art project subject to subjective critique. My severance package provided 3 months of salary, giving me time to consider my options carefully. The termination had been handled quietly. Technova's HR department preferred to avoid publicity about internal conflicts. My official departure was attributed to pursuing new opportunities, and I was under no legal obligation to correct that narrative. Initially, I focused on updating my portfolio and reconnecting with former colleagues who had moved to other companies. The Austin tech scene was tight-knit, and word traveled quickly about talented developers who became available. Within a week, I had preliminary conversations with 3 different companies interested in my background, with enterprise integrations and real-time data processing, but something nagged at me about the situation I'd left behind. Apex Corporation's contract represented more than just revenue for Technova. It was a validation of their capability to handle large-scale enterprise projects. Morrison's insistence on deploying his elegant but dysfunctional system seemed like organizational suicide, yet no one in leadership appeared willing to challenge his technical decisions. Curiosity compelled me to reach out to contacts who remained at Technova. What I learned was both predictable and troubling. Morrison had successfully spun my termination as validation of his quality standards. According to his narrative, my unauthorized deployment had been an act of desperation by someone who couldn't meet professional development criteria. The fact that my implementation had worked was irrelevant. What mattered was following established procedures. David Kumar, who had managed to avoid Morrison's worst attention due to his focus on legacy system maintenance, provided insights into the post-firing atmosphere. Morrison had used my termination as an opportunity to tighten control further. All code commits now required his personal approval, regardless of size or urgency. Developers were spending more time documenting their stylistic choices than implementing features. More concerning was the status of the Apex project. Morrison had convinced leadership that the performance issues demonstrated during the initial presentation were minor configuration problems that would be resolved through proper optimization. He'd assembled a team of junior developers to implement his fixes, confident that adherence to his architectural principles would eventually yield acceptable performance. The reality was less optimistic. According to David, the development team was struggling with fundamental limitations of Morrison's microservices design. The distributed architecture created cascading dependencies that made troubleshooting nearly impossible. Simple operations required coordination between multiple services, introducing latency and potential failure points that didn't exist in traditional architecture. Sarah Chen, who had somehow survived Morrison's purges by becoming an expert at formatting code to his exact specifications, provided additional details about the project's progress. The team had managed to improve performance marginally through aggressive caching and database optimization, but the system still couldn't handle Apex's real-world operational requirements. Apex's patience was wearing thin. Their CTO had begun making pointed comments about performance benchmarks and contract obligations during weekly status calls. Morrison's responses focused on architectural benefits and long-term scalability rather than addressing immediate functionality concerns. The situation reached a critical point in February when Apex scheduled a comprehensive acceptance test using their full production dataset. This would be the definitive evaluation of Morrison's elegant system under real-world conditions. Thousands of simultaneous shipments, integration with multiple carrier APIs, and predictive analytics based on historical patterns spanning several years. Through my network of former colleagues, I learned that Morrison was privately nervous about the acceptance test. He'd spent weeks optimizing the system's performance, but fundamental architectural limitations prevented significant improvement. The microservices design that looked beautiful in code reviews simply couldn't handle the computational and network overhead required for Apex's operation. Meanwhile, I had been consulting with a startup called Innovate Tech Solutions, helping them develop a supply chain optimization platform that shared some similarities with the Apex project. The work was fulfilling in ways I'd forgotten were possible: complex technical challenges, creative problem-solving, and clients who cared more about results than the appearance of the code that delivered them. During one of our planning sessions, Innovate Tech's founder Rachel Martinez mentioned that they were considering bidding on enterprise logistics contracts once their platform matured. She was curious about my experience with large-scale shipping management systems and the technical challenges involved in real-time tracking and predictive analytics. I shared general insights about API integration complexities, data processing requirements, and the importance of robust error handling in logistics operations. Rachel was particularly interested in performance optimization techniques and architectural approaches that could scale from startup operations to enterprise-level deployment. The conversation sparked an idea that would ultimately transform my career and destroy Morrison. What if there was a way to demonstrate the superiority of functional, pragmatic code over elegant but ineffective architecture? What if I could show the business world that Morrison's approach wasn't just inefficient, it was fundamentally flawed? I began working on a comprehensive logistics management platform during my evenings and weekends. Unlike Morrison's microservices architecture, my design prioritized performance and reliability over stylistic consideration. Functions were written to solve problems efficiently rather than conform to arbitrary length restrictions. Variable names balanced clarity with practicality. Comments explained business logic rather than simply restating obvious code operations. The development process was liberating. Without Morrison's constant scrutiny, I could focus on creating solutions that worked rather than implementations that looked good in reviews. Complex algorithms could be optimized for performance without worrying about whether they met aesthetic guidelines. Integration logic could be structured for maintainability rather than conformance to architectural philosophy. Within 6 weeks, I had a working prototype that could handle most of the functionality that Apex required. The system processed real-time tracking data efficiently, integrated smoothly with major carrier APIs, and provided accurate predictive analytics. More importantly, it demonstrated that pragmatic coding approaches could deliver superior results compared to Morrison's elegant but dysfunctional alternatives. Testing my prototype against realistic datasets revealed performance characteristics that would have impressed Apex's technical team. Processing times that took Morrison's system several minutes were completed in seconds. API integrations that frequently failed under load operated smoothly, even when stressed beyond normal parameters. The predictive analytics algorithms provided insights that would have genuine business value for logistics optimization. But I wasn't planning to compete directly with Technova for the Apex contract. That would have been impossible given the legal and ethical complications of my recent termination. Instead, I saw an opportunity to create something much more valuable, a demonstration that functional code could outperform elegant architecture so dramatically that the business world would be forced to reconsider its priorities. The timing was crucial. Apex's acceptance test was scheduled for mid-March, and based on my understanding of Morrison's system limitations, the results would likely be disappointing. If Technova failed to deliver a working solution, Apex would be forced to seek alternatives quickly to meet their operational deadline. I registered a consulting company called Pragmatic Solutions LLC and began reaching out to my professional network about availability for enterprise software development projects. The positioning was carefully crafted. I presented myself as a specialist in rescuing failed software projects and delivering functional solutions under tight deadlines. The response was encouraging. Several contacts mentioned companies that had struggled with over-engineered software solutions that looked impressive in presentations but failed to deliver practical value. There seemed to be a market for developers who prioritized results over rhetoric. In early March, I received an unexpected call from Rebecca Torres, the quality assurance engineer who had documented the decline in development velocity under Morrison's management. She had left Technova the previous month after Morrison blamed her team for identifying too many cosmetic issues that distracted from real quality concerns. Rebecca had inside information about Apex's acceptance test that confirmed my suspicion. Morrison's team had been working around the clock to optimize performance, but the fundamental architectural problems remained unsolved. The latest internal benchmarks showed processing speeds that were still 40% slower than Apex's requirements, and the system crashed consistently when handling peak load scenarios. More significantly, Rebecca revealed that Apex had quietly begun evaluating alternative solutions in case Technova's system failed the acceptance test. Their CTO had reached out to several software development firms about emergency replacement projects, indicating that they were prepared to terminate the contract if necessary. The pieces were falling into place for what would become the most satisfying professional revenge of my career. Morrison's elegant code was about to collide with the unforgiving reality of business requirements, and I was positioned to capitalize on the inevitable failure. I spent the weeks leading up to Apex's acceptance test, refining my prototype and preparing comprehensive documentation that demonstrated its capability. Unlike Morrison's systems, which required extensive explanation to justify their architectural choices, my solution spoke for itself through performance metrics and functional demonstration. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was essentially preparing to profit from Morrison's fundamental misunderstanding of software development priorities. His obsession with code aesthetics had blinded him to the basic requirement that software must actually work in real-world conditions. While he had been perfecting the appearance of his systems, I had been building something that solved actual problems. The acceptance test took place on March 15th, and according to my sources, it was a disaster of epic proportion. Morrison's elegant system failed spectacularly under Apex's production data load. Real-time tracking updates lagged by over 10 minutes, API integrations crashed repeatedly, and the predictive analytics module consumed so much computational resources that it brought down the entire testing environment. Robert Chen's response was reportedly brief and decisive. Apex was terminating the contract immediately and would pursue alternative solutions. Technova had 30 days to return the advance payment and provide documentation for any work completed to specification. Morrison's reaction was predictably defensive. According to David Kumar, who witnessed the post-mortem meeting, Morrison blamed the failure on unrealistic performance expectations and suggested that Apex's requirements were fundamentally incompatible with modern software architecture principles. He maintained that his elegant design was technically superior and that the performance issues were temporary obstacles that could be overcome with additional optimization. Technova's leadership was less sympathetic to architectural philosophy when faced with the loss of their largest contract and potential legal liability for failing to deliver a working system. Morrison's position became untenable when other clients began expressing similar concerns about delayed deliveries and performance problems. 3 days after the Apex debacle, I received a call that would change everything. Robert Chen had obtained my contact information through professional networks and wanted to discuss emergency development services for a logistics management system. Apex needed a working solution within 6 weeks to meet their operational deadlines, and they were willing to pay premium rates for guaranteed results. The conversation was surreal. Robert described exactly the requirements that I had been addressing in my prototype, and his performance expectations aligned perfectly with what my system could deliver. When I demonstrated my solution during a video call later that day, his reaction was immediate and decisive. "This is exactly what we needed from the beginning," he said after watching my system process their test data flawlessly. "When can we start implementation?" The contract negotiation was swift and favorable. Apex was willing to pay $2.5 million for a complete logistics management system, with guaranteed performance benchmarks, and a 6-week delivery timeline. The project scope included everything that Morrison's team had failed to deliver, plus additional features that my flexible architecture could support without significant modifications. Signing that contract felt like vindication on multiple levels. My pragmatic approach to software development had been validated by a major client, willing to pay premium rates for functional solutions. Morrison's elegant but ineffective architecture had been rejected so decisively that his reputation in the industry would likely never recover. But the real satisfaction came from knowing that my inelegant code, the same approach that had cost me my job at Technova, was about to generate more revenue in 6 weeks than Morrison's entire team had produced in 6 months. The amateur hour implementations that Morrison had dismissed were worth $2.5 million to a client who cared more about results than aesthetics. As I prepared to begin the most lucrative project of my career, I couldn't help but smile at the poetic justice of the situation. Morrison had fired me for writing code that worked too well to be considered elegant. Now that same approach was about to make me financially independent, while his beautiful but dysfunctional systems brought down the company that had chosen his philosophy over my functionality. The best revenge, it turned out, wasn't getting even. It was getting paid extremely well to prove that you were right all along. The $2.5 million contract with Apex Corporation transformed my life overnight. What had started as a personal vindication project became the foundation of a legitimate software consulting business. The irony was delicious. Morrison's rejection of my inelegant code had inadvertently positioned me to claim the largest contract in Technova's history. Working from my home office, I threw myself into the Apex project with an intensity I hadn't felt in years. Without Morrison's arbitrary constraints and endless style guide requirements, development proceeded at a pace that surprised even me. Complex integration challenges that would have taken weeks under Technova's bureaucratic review process were solved in days through direct experimentation and iterative testing. The technical freedom was intoxicating. When Apex's legacy mainframe system required custom data parsing, I wrote efficient algorithms that prioritized speed over Morrison's preferred readable implementation. When their real-time tracking needed to handle unexpected carrier API responses, I built robust error handling that caught edge cases rather than elegant exception handlers that looked pretty but failed under stress. Amanda watched this transformation with amazement. The frustrated, stressed person who had been coming home from Technova was replaced by someone who genuinely enjoyed the work again. "You're coding the way you used to when we first met," she observed one evening, as I worked late on Apex's predictive analytics module. "Like you're solving puzzles instead of fighting bureaucracy." She was absolutely right. Software development had returned to what it should be: creative problem-solving constrained by business requirements and technical limitations, not arbitrary aesthetic preferences. Every function I wrote served a purpose, every optimization delivered measurable value, and every architectural decision was justified by performance or maintainability rather than conformance to stylistic philosophy. The Apex system came together beautifully. The real-time tracking module processed shipment updates with millisecond precision, handling data streams from dozens of carrier APIs simultaneously without performance degradation. The predictive analytics engine analyzed historical patterns to forecast delivery delays, route optimizations, and capacity planning with accuracy that impressed even Apex's data science team. Most satisfying was the system's resilience under stress testing. Where Morrison's microservices architecture had collapsed under realistic load conditions, my monolithic approach with carefully optimized subsystems handled peak operational scenarios effortlessly. The elegant distributed design that had looked so impressive in architectural diagrams was thoroughly outperformed by code that prioritized function over form. Robert Chen's weekly progress reviews became celebrations rather than interrogation. Unlike Morrison's sessions, which focused on code formatting and adherence to style guidelines, Robert's questions centered on business value and operational impact. He wanted to understand how the system would improve Apex's efficiency, reduce operational costs, and provide competitive advantages in the logistics market. "This is exactly what enterprise software should be," Robert commented during a demonstration of the completed tracking interface. "It solves our problems without requiring us to change our business processes to accommodate the software's limitations." That statement crystallized the fundamental difference between my approach and Morrison. Morrison's systems required clients to adapt their workflows to match his architectural preferences. My solutions adapted to client requirements, providing the functionality they needed in ways that integrated naturally with their existing operation. 3 weeks into the Apex project, I received an unexpected visitor. David Kumar appeared at my front door on a Saturday morning, looking haggard and carrying a resignation letter in his hand. Technova's situation had deteriorated rapidly since the Apex contract termination, and David had finally reached his breaking point. "Morrison's completely lost touch with reality," David explained over coffee in my kitchen. "He's convinced that Apex's contract termination proves that the market isn't ready for professional-grade software architecture. He's doubled down on style enforcement and is now requiring architectural design documents for even minor bug fixes." The picture David painted was of a company in freefall. 2 more senior developers had quit without notice after Morrison rejected working bug fixes because they didn't conform to his latest architectural guideline. Client complaints were escalating as delivery times stretched longer and longer. Project managers were openly questioning technical decisions in meetings, leading to heated confrontations about development priority. More importantly for my own situation, David revealed that several Technova clients were quietly exploring alternative development resources. Morrison's reputation for delivering beautiful but dysfunctional software had spread through Austin's business community, and companies with critical software needs were seeking more reliable partners. Sterling Analytics is looking for someone to rebuild their data visualization platform, David mentioned almost casually. Morrison's latest updates broke half their reporting functionality, and they're furious about the delay. They specifically asked if I knew any developers who prioritize working solutions over architectural purity. Sterling Analytics had been one of my favorite clients during my Technova days. Their business intelligence requirements aligned perfectly with my skills in data processing and real-time analytics. The prospect of working with them again on my own terms was incredibly appealing. I contacted Sterling's CTO, Patricia Hoffman, the following Monday. Her response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Marcus, we've been hoping you'd reach out. Morrison's changes to your original visualization system have been an absolute disaster. We need someone who can deliver functional software that actually meets our requirements." The Sterling contract, worth $800,000 for a complete data visualization platform rebuild, became my second major client. Unlike the Apex project, which had been emergency replacement work, Sterling represented validation that my approach had sustainable market value. Companies were willing to pay premium rates for developers who delivered working solutions rather than architectural art projects. Word spread quickly through Austin's tech community about Pragmatic Solutions' success with high-profile clients. My LinkedIn profile was flooded with connection requests from companies seeking alternatives to traditional development firms. Project managers who had been burned by over-engineered solutions were particularly interested in my pragmatic approach to software development. By May, I had more client inquiries than I could handle as a solo consultant. The demand for functional, results-oriented software development was apparently much larger than I had anticipated. Companies across various industries had been struggling with beautiful but dysfunctional systems delivered by developers who prioritized aesthetics over effectiveness. Meanwhile, Technova's downward spiral continued to accelerate. Through my network of former colleagues, I learned that Morrison had been placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation into project management practices. The company's leadership had finally realized that his architectural philosophy was incompatible with profitable software development. Jennifer Walsh, the HR director, had compiled a devastating report documenting the correlation between Morrison's tenure and declining client satisfaction. Project delivery times had increased by 200%, bug reports had tripled, and client retention had dropped to its lowest level in company history. Several major clients had terminated contracts specifically citing performance and reliability issues with Morrison's Elegant system. The investigation revealed additional problems that hadn't been visible during Morrison's reign. His microservices architecture, while beautiful in theory, had created maintenance nightmares that were consuming enormous amounts of developer time. Simple updates required coordinating changes across multiple services, turning routine maintenance into complex orchestration exercises. More damaging was the discovery that Morrison's coding standards had actually reduced overall code quality, rather than improving. Developers forced to conform to his arbitrary style guidelines had been making functional compromises to satisfy cosmetic requirements. Bug reports showed that many issues stemmed from oversimplified error handling and artificially modularized code that obscured rather than clarified program logic. The final nail in Morrison's coffin came when an external security audit revealed that his architectural preferences had introduced multiple vulnerabilities. The distributed nature of his microservices design created additional attack vectors that didn't exist in traditional architecture. His emphasis on clean code had resulted in simplified input validation that failed to catch malicious data patterns. Technova's board terminated Morrison's employment in June and hired an interim engineering director with a mandate to restore the company's technical credibility. Unfortunately, the damage was extensive and potentially irreversible. Several major clients had already committed to alternative development partners, and the company's reputation in Austin's business community was severely compromised. The interim director, Michelle Roberts, reached out to former employees about potential consulting arrangements to help stabilize ongoing projects. Her call to me was professionally awkward but personally satisfying. Technova, the company that had fired me for writing functional code, was now seeking my help to repair the damage caused by Morrison's elegant but dysfunctional alternative. We need someone who can evaluate our current systems and recommend practical improvements, Michelle explained during our initial conversation. Your reputation for delivering working solutions is exactly what we need to rebuild client confidence. The consulting opportunity presented an interesting dilemma. Working with Technova could provide valuable insights into the full extent of Morrison's impact, while potentially helping former colleagues who had suffered under his management. However, it also risked legitimizing the company that had chosen architectural philosophy over practical functionality. After careful consideration, I proposed a limited engagement, focused on technical assessment, rather than active development. I would evaluate Morrison's systems, document their functional limitations, and provide recommendations for practical improvements. The arrangement would allow me to help former colleagues without directly competing with my independent consulting business. The assessment took 2 weeks and revealed problems that exceeded even my pessimistic expectations. Morrison's elegant architectures had created a technical debt crisis that would require months of intensive work to resolve. Systems that should have been straightforward to maintain had become labyrinthine puzzles that required extensive documentation just to understand basic functionality. The Meridian financial fraud detection system, which I had originally designed as a robust real-time processing engine, had been transformed into a distributed nightmare that processed transactions slower than manual review method. Morrison's microservices approach had introduced so much network overhead that the system couldn't meet its original performance benchmarks. Project Lighthouse, the analytics platform that had originally showcased my capabilities, was barely functional under Morrison's architectural improvement. The elegant modular design required constant manual intervention to maintain data consistency, and routine operations that had been automated in my original implementation now required multiple manual steps. Most disturbing was the discovery that several critical business functions had been quietly bypassed because Morrison's systems couldn't handle real-world operational requirements. Clients had developed workarounds and manual processes to compensate for software that looked professional but failed to deliver practical value. My assessment report was blunt and comprehensive. Morrison's architectural changes had transformed functional systems into beautiful but ineffective showcases that prioritized appearance over result. Restoring basic functionality would require either extensive modifications to conform his elegant designs to practical requirements, or complete rebuilds using architectures that prioritized performance and reliability. The report's impact on Technova's leadership was immediate and decisive. Michelle Roberts presented my findings to the board along with cost estimates for repairs that would have consumed the company's remaining cash reserve. The mathematical reality was unavoidable. Morrison's pursuit of elegant code had created technical debt that exceeded the company's ability to service. Technova's board voted to begin liquidation proceedings in July. The company that had once been Austin's most promising enterprise software developer would be dissolved and its assets sold to pay creditors. Morrison's architectural philosophy had not only cost him his career but had ultimately destroyed the entire organization. The irony was profound and deeply satisfying. My inelegant code, which had been deemed unworthy of professional development standards, was generating millions in revenue through pragmatic solutions. Meanwhile, Morrison's elegant architectures had proven so dysfunctional that they had literally bankrupted the company that embraced them. As Technova's liquidation proceeded, several former colleagues reached out about joining Pragmatic Solutions. The demand for functional software development had grown beyond what I could handle independently, and building a team of developers who shared my pragmatic philosophy seemed like a natural evolution. David Kumar became my first full-time employee, bringing his expertise in legacy system integration and his first-hand knowledge of Morrison's architectural failure. Sarah Chen joined as a senior developer, eager to work in an environment where functional solutions were valued over stylistic conformance. Rebecca Torres established our quality assurance practices, focusing on real-world performance rather than adherence to arbitrary coding standards. By August, Pragmatic Solutions had grown from a one-person consulting operation to a thriving software development firm with 6 employees and a client waiting list that extended into the following year. Our success was built entirely on the principle that Morrison had rejected, that working software was more valuable than beautiful architecture. The final chapter of my revenge against Morrison came in September when I received a certified letter from Technova's bankruptcy attorney. As part of the liquidation process, all outstanding invoices were being settled according to a court-approved payment schedule. Enclosed was a check for $2.5 million, representing the full payment for my Apex Corporation contract, money that Technova had received from Apex as an advance, but had never been able to earn through delivery of working software. The check represented more than just financial compensation. It was tangible proof that functional pragmatic code had not only survived Morrison's assault on practical software development, but had thrived in ways that his elegant alternatives never could. The amateur hour implementations that had cost me my job had ultimately generated more value than his entire architectural philosophy. Sitting in my expanded office, surrounded by a team of developers who shared my commitment to solutions that actually worked, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. Morrison's rejection of my approach had inadvertently positioned me to claim the very success that his methods had promised, but failed to deliver. The best revenge, I realized, wasn't just proving that Morrison was wrong. It was building something successful and sustainable on the foundation of everything he had dismissed as unprofessional. Every dollar earned by Pragmatic Solutions was a testament to the value of code that prioritized function over form, results over rhetoric, and practical solutions over architectural purity. Morrison had taught me an invaluable lesson, though not the one he intended. The pursuit of elegant code at the expense of functional requirements wasn't just misguided. It was a form of professional suicide that inevitably collapsed when confronted with real-world business needs. My inelegant approach had proven to be the most elegant solution of all. 2 years have passed since Technova's bankruptcy, and the transformation has been extraordinary. Pragmatic Solutions now occupies 3 floors of a downtown Austin office building, employs 42 developers, and maintains contracts with some of the largest enterprises in Texas. What started as personal vindication has evolved into a movement that's reshaping how the software industry thinks about code quality and professional standards. The success hasn't gone unnoticed. Last month, Austin Business Journal featured Pragmatic Solutions on their cover with the headline, "Function over Form," How one developer's firing led to a $50 million success. The article detailed how my termination from Technova for writing inelegant code had inadvertently created one of the region's fastest-growing technology companies. The journalist Maria Santos was particularly fascinated by the philosophical divide that had separated my approach from Morrison's. "It seems like you've proven that the industry's obsession with beautiful code might actually be counterproductive," she observed during our interview. "Your clients are paying premium rates for solutions that prioritize functionality over aesthetics." She was absolutely correct. Pragmatic Solutions' client roster reads like a who's who of companies that had been burned by over-engineered software projects. Manufacturing giants, tired of systems that looked impressive in demonstrations but failed under production loads. Financial institutions seeking trading platforms that processed transactions reliably rather than conforming to architectural philosophy. Healthcare networks needing patient management systems that worked intuitively for medical staff instead of satisfying abstract design principles. Our competitive advantage became increasingly clear as we handled more complex projects. While other development firms spent weeks debating architectural purity and code formatting standards, we focused on understanding business requirements and delivering solutions that solved actual problems. Clients consistently chose practical functionality over theoretical elegance when given the option. The contrast was particularly evident when we competed directly against firms that had adopted Morrison-style development philosophies. During a recent bid for a logistics management system with continental shipping, our proposal emphasized performance benchmarks, integration capabilities, and maintenance requirements. Our competitor's presentation focused on microservices architecture, code modularity, and adherence to industry best practices. Continental's technical evaluation revealed the fundamental difference between these approaches. Our prototype handled their test data efficiently, integrated smoothly with existing systems, and provided the real-time analytics they needed for operational optimization. The competitor's elegant architecture struggled with basic functionality, required extensive customization to meet requirements, and introduced dependencies that would have complicated future maintenance. Continental's CTO, James Wu, summarized their decision succinctly. Pragmatic Solutions delivered exactly what we asked for, while the other firm delivered what they thought we should want. There's a huge difference between those two approaches. That philosophy has become Pragmatic Solutions' defining characteristic. We don't impose architectural preferences on clients, we adapt our solutions to their actual needs. If a client needs a monolithic system that processes data efficiently, we build monolithic systems. If distributed architecture genuinely provides business value, we implement distributed solutions. The architectural decision serves the functional requirement, not the other way around. This client-focused approach has generated remarkable loyalty and referral. Companies that have experienced the frustration of beautiful but dysfunctional software actively seek out developers who prioritize results over rhetoric. Our client retention rate exceeds 90%, and most new business comes through direct referrals from satisfied customers. The financial success has been equally remarkable. Pragmatic Solutions revenue grew from my initial $2.5 million Apex contract to over $50 million annually. We've become profitable enough to be selective about projects, choosing clients whose requirements align with our strengths, rather than accepting any contract that comes along. More satisfying than the financial metrics has been the impact on individual careers within the company. David Kumar, who had been demoralized by Morrison's micromanagement, has blossomed into one of our most innovative senior architects. His designs consistently solve complex integration challenges while maintaining the simplicity that clients value. Sarah Chen has developed into a team leader whose developers produce consistently reliable code without being constrained by arbitrary style guidelines. Rebecca Torres has built a quality assurance program that focuses on real-world performance rather than adherence to coding standards. Her team's testing protocols identify actual bugs and usability issues instead of cosmetic violations of style guides. The result is software that works reliably in production environments rather than looking impressive in code review. Perhaps most importantly, we've created a work environment where developers can focus on creative problem-solving rather than bureaucratic compliance. New hires consistently comment on the difference between pragmatic solutions, culture, and their previous experiences with style-obsessed management. I can actually think about the best way to solve problems, instead of worrying about whether my variable names will pass review, observed Jennifer Park, a senior developer who joined us from a firm that had adopted Morrison-style development practices. The industry recognition has been gratifying but secondary to the practical impact we've achieved. Pragmatic Solutions received the Austin Tech Alliance's Innovation Award for demonstrating that functional software design can outperform traditional architectural approaches. The award ceremony provided an opportunity to articulate our philosophy to a broader audience of technology leaders. The software industry has spent decades debating the aesthetics of code while losing sight of its fundamental purpose. I explained during the acceptance speech. Code exists to solve problems, not to satisfy subjective preferences about formatting and structure. When we prioritize function over form, everyone benefits. Developers enjoy more creative freedom, clients receive solutions that actually work, and businesses achieve better outcomes from their technology investment. The speech resonated with many attendees who had experienced similar frustrations with over-engineered projects. Several approached me afterward to share stories of beautiful systems that had failed to deliver business value and functional solutions that had been rejected for aesthetic reasons. One conversation was particularly memorable. Lisa Rodriguez, the CTO of a major healthcare network, described her experience with an electronic medical records system that had been designed according to the latest architectural best practices. The system was a masterpiece of modular design and elegant code structure, she explained. It was also completely unusable by our medical staff, who needed to access patient information quickly during emergencies. We ended up spending millions more to rebuild it with a focus on practical functionality. These stories reinforced my conviction that Morrison's approach represented a widespread industry problem rather than an isolated case of misguided management. The obsession with code aesthetics had infected numerous organizations, creating a culture where looking professional mattered more than being effective. The ultimate vindication came last spring when I received an unexpected LinkedIn message from Bradley Morrison himself. He had been unemployed since Technova's bankruptcy, struggling to find engineering positions that matched his previous role and salary expectations. His message was carefully worded but unmistakably desperate. "Marcus, I've been following Pragmatic Solutions' success and would be interested in discussing potential opportunities to contribute to your team's achievements. My experience with enterprise architecture and quality standards could complement your organization's growth trajectory." The irony was breathtaking. Morrison, who had fired me for writing inelegant code, was now seeking employment with the company built on everything he had rejected as unprofessional. The man who had insisted that my functional approach was incompatible with serious software development wanted to join the team that had proven him spectacularly wrong. I responded professionally but declined his inquiry. Morrison's skills might have improved since Technova's collapse, but his fundamental philosophy remained incompatible with Pragmatic Solutions' culture. More importantly, hiring him would have sent the wrong message to our team about the values that had driven our success. Instead, I used the opportunity to reflect on the broader lessons learned from this experience. Morrison's failure wasn't really about individual incompetence. It was about the dangers of prioritizing abstract principles over concrete results. His elegant architecture philosophy had merit in academic settings where theoretical purity was valued above practical outcomes. In commercial software development, where clients pay for solutions to real problems, his approach was fundamentally misaligned with business needs. The contrast between Technova's fate and Pragmatic Solutions' success illustrated the market's ultimate judgment on these competing philosophies. Companies consistently chose functional solutions over elegant architecture when forced to make the choice explicit. The demand for practical software development had proven much larger than anyone anticipated, suggesting that Morrison's approach had been more widespread and problematic than initially apparent. This realization led to Pragmatic Solutions' most ambitious project yet, establishing an industry certification program for functional software development. Working with several universities and industry organizations, we're developing educational curricula that emphasize problem-solving skills over adherence to coding standards. The goal is to train developers who can balance technical excellence with practical effectiveness. The certification program has attracted interest from major technology companies seeking alternatives to traditional computer science education. Google, Microsoft, and Amazon have all expressed interest in hiring graduates from programs that emphasize functional problem-solving over theoretical computer science concepts. There's a real need for developers who can bridge the gap between academic computer science and practical business requirements, explained Dr. Patricia Chen, chair of the Computer Science Department at the University of Texas. Your program addresses that need by focusing on skills that translate directly into commercial software development success. The educational initiative represents the long-term impact I hope to achieve beyond Pragmatic Solutions' commercial success. If we can influence how the next generation of developers thinks about code quality and professional standards, we might prevent future Morrisons from damaging companies and careers with misguided perfectionism. Looking back on the journey from Technova's conference room to Pragmatic Solutions' executive suite, the transformation seems almost surreal. What began as professional humiliation became the foundation for remarkable success, but the path wasn't predetermined or guaranteed. The outcome depended on recognizing that Morrison's rejection represented an opportunity rather than a defeat. The key insight was understanding that functional software development represented an underserved market niche rather than an inferior approach to professional programming. Companies had been suffering with beautiful but dysfunctional systems because they believed that was the price of professional-grade development. Demonstrating that functional solutions could be both technically excellent and aesthetically acceptable opened up enormous business opportunity. Most importantly, the experience taught me that industry consensus doesn't always reflect market reality. Morrison's architectural philosophy was widely accepted within the software development community, but it failed to deliver value to actual clients with real business needs. Sometimes the most contrarian approach turns out to be the most commercially viable. Today, as I review Pragmatic Solutions' quarterly results, showing record revenue and client satisfaction scores, I'm struck by the profound irony of Morrison's role in our success. His insistence on firing me for writing inelegant code created the circumstances that allowed me to prove the superiority of my approach on a scale that would have been impossible as a Technova employee. The $2.5 million check that sits framed in my office serves as a daily reminder that functional code isn't just morally superior to elegant architecture, it's dramatically more valuable in the marketplace where software actually matters. Morrison taught me that lesson, though certainly not intentionally, and I'll be grateful for that education for the rest of my career. The best revenge I learned isn't proving your enemies wrong, it's building something so successful on the foundation of what they rejected, that their philosophy becomes obviously obsolete. Morrison fired me for writing code that worked too well to be considered professional. That amateur hour approach has now generated enough success to make his elegant alternatives look like expensive mistakes. In the end, the market provided the ultimate code review and functional solutions passed with flying colors, while elegant architecture failed spectacularly. No style guide in the world can argue with $50 million in annual revenue and a client satisfaction rate that exceeds industry benchmarks. Morrison may have thought he was enforcing professional standards when he fired me for inelegant code. Instead, he inadvertently launched a company that redefined what professional software development actually means. The irony is perfect, the revenge is complete, and the lessons learned will influence the industry for decades to come. Looking for more? We've got two amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest upload.